In 1882, the state of Texas traded 3 million acres of land for a building. Not just any building, the largest state capitol in America, with a dome deliberately designed to stand 7 feet taller than the one in Washington. And not just any land, a single unbroken tract in the Panhandle, 200 miles long and 30 miles wide, stretching from the Oklahoma border nearly to Lubbock, larger than the entire state of Connecticut. Nobody in Austin had ever set foot on most of it. The Comanche had been driven off that ground only 6 years earlier. The buffalo hunters had swept through and slaughtered the herds. What remained was emptiness, flat, waterless, wind-scraped grassland at the edge of the known world. Texas was land-rich and cash-poor, and the politicians figured 3 million acres of nothing was a fair price for a monument in pink granite. What they actually set in motion was the creation of the largest fenced ranch the world has ever seen, an empire of beef and barbed wire that sprawled across 10 counties, employed 150 cowboys, ran 150,000 head of cattle, erected 325 windmills to pull water from beneath the plains, strung 1,500 miles of barbed wire fencing across country that had never known a fence post, trailed steers 1,000 miles to Montana, and never, in 27 years of operation, reliably made a dime. The deal that created the XIT Ranch begins with a fire. On November 9, 1881, the Texas state capitol in Austin, a 3-story limestone building that had served since 1853, a building that cost $150,000 to construct and measured a modest 140 by 90 feet, caught fire while the Capitol Board was actually meeting inside. The plans for the new Capitol they had been discussing barely escaped the flames. The legislature had already been talking about a replacement for years. The Texas Constitutional Convention of 1875 had set aside 3 million acres of public land in the Panhandle specifically to fund a new state house. But action dragged. Nobody had treated it as urgent. The fire changed that overnight. Governor Oran Roberts called a special legislative session. A temporary capitol was hastily erected across the street from Capitol Square to house the state government. In early 1881, a nationwide design competition had been announced with a prize of $1,700. 11 entries from 8 architects arrived. The winner was Elijah E. Myers of Detroit, who had already designed the capitals of Michigan and Colorado, and who proposed an Italian Renaissance revival structure in the grand manner, 566 feet long, 288 feet wide, 4 stories tall, with 392 rooms, 18 vaults, 924 windows, 404 doors, and that ambitious dome topped by a zinc goddess of liberty. The question was, who would pay for it? Texas had the land, but not the cash. In 1882, the legislature initially valued those 3 million Panhandle acres at $1.5 million, 50 cents an acre for land no one had settled. In early 1882, a contractor named Matthias Schnell of Rock Island, Illinois, accepted the deal. Build the capitol, receive the acreage. Schnell almost immediately transferred 3/4 of his interest to a Chicago outfit called Taylor, Babcock and Company, which reorganized itself as the Capitol Syndicate. Several months later, after rumors surfaced that Schnell had bribed one of the Capitol commissioners, he assigned the rest of his contract to the syndicate and faded from the story entirely. The principals were Colonel Abner Taylor, Colonel Amos Babcock, and 2 brothers who were about to become the unlikely lords of the largest ranch in Texas, Charles B. Farwell and John V. Farwell. The Farwells were not ranchers. They were dry goods merchants, and enormously successful ones. Their firm, John V. Farwell and Company, was one of the biggest wholesale operations in Chicago, pulling in nearly $10 million in annual sales by 1870 and double that by 1883, with 600 employees working out of an 8-story headquarters at Monroe and Market Streets. Charles had come to Chicago on a wagon load of wheat with $10 in his pocket. He served as Cook County clerk, got elected to Congress 4 times, and sat in the United States Senate from 1887 to 1891. John was the quieter brother, a devout Methodist who donated land in downtown Chicago for the city's first YMCA building, held church services for cowboys when he visited the ranch, and was once appointed Commissioner of Indian Affairs by President Ulysses Grant. These were men who understood ledgers, supply chains, and the mechanics of large-scale business far better than they understood cattle. That fact would define everything the XIT became. Before the first steer arrived in the Panhandle, the Syndicate had to actually build the capital. The original plans called for native Texas limestone, but the stone quarried near Austin streaked with iron when exposed to air. Abner Taylor proposed importing limestone from Indiana, but Governor John Ireland insisted on Texas materials. The owners of Granite Mountain, near what is now Marble Falls in Burnett County, offered to donate all the red granite the project needed, a distinctive stone the color of a West Texas sunset that would give the building its famous appearance. Taylor initially resisted. Granite was far harder to cut than limestone, and the cost of shaping it would be punishing. Then came a compromise. Use the donated sunset red granite, but simplify the exterior carving. The economics worked, but the labor didn't. To cut costs at the quarry, the state approved the use of convict labor, predominantly black prisoners from the state penitentiary system. The International Association of Granite Cutters saw this as a direct assault on their trade and wages. By a vote of 500 to 1, the union declared a nationwide boycott. Every skilled granite cutter in the country was warned to stay away from Austin. Construction stalled. The contractor, a Pomeranian immigrant named Gustav Wilk, responded by sending a recruiter to Aberdeen, Scotland, a city famous for its granite workers, and promised wages of $4 to $6 a day. More than 120 Scottish stonecutters crossed the Atlantic. Union representatives met them at the dock in New York and told them the truth about the convict labor and the boycott. 24 turned around and went home. The rest continued to Texas, where they found wages far lower than promised. Wilk was eventually fined $65,000 for violating the Alien Contract Labor Act. By May 1887, only 15 of the Scottish workers remained on the job. Meanwhile, the number of convicts at the quarry actually increased, from 300 to 350. The boycott, measured by its own goals, was a failure. The building went up anyway. On April 21st, 1888, San Jacinto Day, the Texas state capitol opened its doors to the public for the first time. It was dedicated during a week-long celebration in May, though the Capitol Board initially refused to accept it because the copper roof leaked. After repairs, the building was formally received on December 6, 1888. Total cost, $3,744,630.60, of which the Syndicate paid $3,224,593.45. The state of Texas covered the rest. That pink granite structure still stands today, still houses the legislature, still draws tourists who crane their necks up at the dome. It is, by square footage, the largest state capitol in the nation. But while the granite was being quarried and the dome was rising in Austin, something else was happening 200 miles north of Lubbock, on that enormous tract of Panhandle prairie that was supposed to be worthless. Colonel Babcock was the first of the Syndicate men to actually see the land. He arrived in Mobeetie, Texas in March 1882, carrying a letter from General Philip Sheridan that got him a 4-mule ambulance and a wagon from nearby Fort Elliott. With a surveyor named William Mabry, the Oldham County clerk, a handful of area cowboys, and a Mexican cook, the odd little caravan set out across the Panhandle and spent 36 days covering over 950 miles from Buffalo Springs near the Oklahoma border all the way down to Yellow House Creek in Hockley County. Picture it. A Chicago colonel riding in a military ambulance across land the Comanche had owned 6 years prior. Land where buffalo bones still bleached in the sun. Land where there was no road, no settlement, no mark of human habitation in any direction. What he found was not nothing. It was grass. Miles and miles of grass, short and nutritious, the kind that had once sustained millions of buffalo. And during the survey, Babcock and Mabry discovered something else. A mistake in the boundary survey done by John H. Clark back in 1859 had placed the New Mexico line too far east. The Syndicate took measures to correct it, eventually saving Texas a strip of land a half-mile or more wide and 310 miles long, an accidental gift from the men who had come to take 3 million acres. The Syndicate's original plan had been to subdivide the land and sell it to farmers and settlers. But the Panhandle in the early 1880s was too raw, too remote, too dry for that. The railroad hadn't arrived yet. There were no reliable wells. There was no town within a day's ride of most of the acreage. Nobody was buying. So they decided to run cattle on it until the land became valuable enough to sell. The ranch was never supposed to be permanent. From the very first day, the XIT was a holding pattern, a way to extract some return from 3 million acres while waiting for civilization to catch up. B.H. Campbell, a Kansas rancher whose nickname Barbecue came from the barbecue brand he used on his Medicine Lodge Creek spread in the Indian Territory, was hired as the first general manager. Under Campbell's direction, the first herd of 2,500 longhorns arrived at Buffalo Springs on July 1st, 1885. They had been driven up from the Fort Concho area in central Texas by a trail driver named Abner P. Blocker. According to legend, it was Blocker who created the XIT brand. Campbell asked him for a design that rustlers couldn't easily alter, and Blocker squatted on his boot heels in the corral dust at Buffalo Springs and scratched 3 letters with his toe, XIT. It could be burned with a single straight iron, and the interlocking strokes made it hard to modify, though the rustlers eventually figured out they could turn it into a star cross if they burned the T at a crooked angle. The legend that XIT stood for 10 in Texas, referring to the 10 counties the ranch covered, is a good story, but it's almost certainly folklore. Blocker's practical thinking, make it hard to steal, is far more likely the real origin. The fencing came next, and the scale of it still staggers the imagination. 210 carloads of barbed wire, 101,000 cedar posts, and a full carload of staples were freighted from Fort Dodge, Kansas, a haul of 250 to 270 miles. By the end of 1886, 781 miles of fence line were in place, including a west line running 260 miles and an east line stretching 275. Cross fences were added through the 1890s to divide the ranch into 94 separate pastures, bringing the total to 1,500 miles of fencing. The wire itself amounted to roughly 6,000 miles. You could have strung a line from New York to Los Angeles and had enough left over to reach Denver. The ranch was organized into 8 divisions, each with its own headquarters, foreman, bunkhouses, corrals, barns, and 2-wagon freight outfit. From north to south, Buffalo Springs, the steer pasture, up near the Oklahoma line. Middlewater for culls and undesirable stock. Ojo Bravo, Bold Spring, considered the prettiest stretch of the entire ranch. Then Alamocitas, Rita Blanca, Escarbada, Spring Lake, and Yellow Houses, named for clay bluffs along the Canadian River that looked yellow from a distance. General headquarters started at Buffalo Springs, then moved to Channing after the Fort Worth and Denver City Railway pushed through Hartley County in 1888. The railroad was the lifeline. Without it, getting cattle to market would have meant trailing them hundreds of miles to Kansas railheads. Within the next year, 110,721 cattle valued at $1,322,587 had been purchased and driven onto the range. After 1887, large-scale buying ceased, and the herd leveled off at 150,000 head, roughly one cow for every 20 acres. At peak operations, 150 cowboys rode a remuda of 1,000 horses, managed 45 wagons and 100 mules, and branded 35,000 calves in a single year. Each division wrote a monthly report and an annual report, containing details about the cattle, the range weather, and the men employed. The paperwork alone would have filled a Chicago counting house. Cowboys earned $25 to $30 a month, plus room and board. And they lived under a code of conduct that would have startled anyone who associated the Panhandle with the lawlessness of the Wild West. The general rules of the XIT Ranch, printed and distributed in January 1888, banned firearms, alcohol, gambling, and card playing of any kind. Employees could not own private livestock or horses on ranch property. They could not hunt game using company horses. Loafers, tramps, gamblers, and disreputable persons were not to be entertained at any camp. It is the aim of the owners of this ranch, the rule book stated, to conduct it on the basis of a well-organized business. That phrase tells the whole story. The XIT was not some romantic cowboy kingdom. It was a corporate enterprise, owned by Chicago businessmen, financed by British aristocrats, and managed according to the principles of industrial organization. In 1888, a telephone line was strung from Tascosa to Alamocitos. By the early 1900s, telephones were placed across the ranch wherever possible, with the top wire of the barbed wire fences used as phone lines. The service was atrocious, according to historian J. Evetts Haley, but it allowed rapid communication about emergencies like grass fires that required every available hand. There was even talk among technology enthusiasts that cowboys might one day carry phones in their saddlebags and clip onto the fence wire to report problems. The old hands reportedly scoffed at the notion. But the impulse behind it, efficiency, systematization, the elimination of wasted time, was pure syndicate thinking. John Farwell had gone to London in late 1884 to raise capital, incorporating the Capital Freehold Land and Investment Company to sell debentures yielding 5% interest. He planned to raise $15 million. He got $10 million and issued bonds at 7% for the rest. The shareholders included the Earl of Aberdeen and Henry Seton Carr, a member of Parliament. These were men who expected returns, not adventure stories. They wanted dividends, and the dividends were slow in coming. The timing was catastrophic. Cattle was the investment bubble of the day in the 1880s. The prospect of money-making ranches appealed to investors from Chicago to London, and the cattle boom had drawn speculative capital from across the Atlantic. Cattle prices in Chicago, the center of the American meatpacking industry, had peaked in 1884 at around $4.75 per hundredweight. By 1886, prices had fallen by half. That same year, the infamous winter of 1886 to 87, the Great Die-Up, devastated herds across the Great Plains. In Wyoming, ranchers lost 75% of their cattle. The Texas Panhandle was hit less severely, but the market collapse was universal. In the fall of 1888, the XIT was unable to sell its cattle at a profit, and the costs of operating a 3-million-acre ranch were enormous. Fencing, windmills, 325 of them by 1900, pumping water from an average depth of 125 feet, with 100 earthen dams besides, all at a total cost of around $500,000. Cowboys' wages, feed, freight charges, losses to disease, drought, blizzards, and prairie fire. And then there were the wolves. With the buffalo gone and the natural prey base destroyed, the gray wolves and lobos of the Llano Estacado turned to cattle. During calving season especially, the predation was terrible. Wolves deprived of their natural prey took what Haley called a terrible annual toll among the cattle, and a single determined pack could kill dozens of newborn calves in a week. The ranch paid bounties for wolf pelts, and many cowboys earned extra money wolfing, tracking and killing wolves across the range, often alone on horseback for days at a stretch in country where you could ride for hours without seeing a fence post. It was grim, lonesome work, and it was never quite enough. The Dust Bowl, years later, would produce an image preserved in the XIT Museum in Dalhart. A crow's nest found in a windmill, constructed entirely out of scraps of barbed wire, because the dust storms had stripped every piece of vegetation from the land. The wire was the only building material left. That nest, made of the same material that had enclosed the ranch, sits in a museum case to this day. Rustlers were another constant drain. Smaller ranchers pushing into the Panhandle and adjacent New Mexico territory saw the vast XIT herds as an inexhaustible supply. The brand could be altered, fence lines could be cut. The XIT men responded by organizing vigilante posses and hiring men with particular qualifications. Ira Ayton, a former Texas Ranger who had once rigged dynamite charges to fence posts to deter fence cutters, a scheme his superiors quickly shut down, married a cousin of General Manager Albert Boyce and was hired as foreman of the Escarbada Division in 1895. He assembled a ranch police force of 20 cowboys armed with Winchester rifles, including 2 former Rangers. For 10 years, Ayton patrolled the Escarbada Range. He was not a man who tolerated ambiguity about property lines. In 1889, the ranch began improving its herd, introducing Hereford and polled Aberdeen Angus cattle to strengthen the breed beyond the original Texas Longhorns. Registered herds were purchased in 1892. The Rito Blanco division bred the Angus, while Escarbada, Spring Lake, and Yellow Houses bred the Herefords. The Powell brothers, James and William, Englishmen living in Channing, became the first to breed Hereford cattle in the entire Panhandle, working closely with the ranch. It was another sign of the Syndicate's corporate mentality. They were not sentimental about Longhorns. They wanted meat that would sell in Chicago. Campbell, the first manager, was pushed out in 1887 after reports surfaced that the ranch had become a stopping place and rendezvous for a large number of bad men and criminals. Senator A.L. Matlock of Montague investigated on the Syndicate's behalf. Campbell resigned and went back to Kansas. Albert Boyce took over on January 1, 1888, and ran the ranch for the next decade. Under Boyce, the XIT reached its operational peak. But operational peak and financial success were 2 different things. The ranch operated largely without profit throughout most of its lifespan. The frustrations compounded. Delays in drilling wells sometimes killed cattle for lack of water. Prairie fires could devour thousands of acres of grass in a day. Droughts cracked the earth. Blizzards froze stock where it stood. The Syndicate tried to expand its way out of trouble. Starting in the late 1880s, the XIT began trailing 2-year-old steers north to Montana, where they could fatten on rich northern grasses, a practice called double wintering. The northern trail ran from Buffalo Springs all the way to Cedar Creek, 60 miles north of Miles City, Montana, a drive of over 1,000 miles through 7 states. Each year, the XIT trailed roughly 12,500 cattle up that route. At the height of the Montana operation, as many as 65,000 XIT steers grazed on 2 million leased acres between the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers, with 1,000 cows brought up from Texas to raise beef for the roundup wagons and line camps. 2 long creeks, the Redwater and the Big Dry, meandered through the heart of the XIT's Montana range, and during summer months, most of the cattle gathered near their banks. Texas cowboys and Texas foremen ran the show 1,000 miles from home. A cowboy named Bob Fudge, all 250 pounds of him, helped drive 2 herds north and stayed on in Montana for years. Some of the Texans chose to remain permanently, settling into the country as ranchers and citizens. But by 1897, settlers and their fences had closed the trail from Texas to Miles City. The XIT's final herds walked north that year. After that, moving steers to Montana meant shipping by rail. In 1902 alone, 22,000 head went north in cattle cars, and the railroad rates ate into already thin margins. The Montana operation suspended in 1898, reopened in 1902, then shut down permanently in 1912. By the late 1890s, the British bondholders were losing patience. They had invested millions and received little in return. The debentures were coming due. The Capital Syndicate began doing what it had always planned to do, selling the land. But now it was less a business strategy and more a matter of survival. George W. Littlefield, an Austin banker and former Confederate officer, was the first major buyer, purchasing 235,858 acres from the Yellow Houses Division at $2 an acre. William E. Halsell paid the same rate for 184,155 acres out of the Spring Lake Division and built his Mashed O Ranch on the ground. John M. Shelton developed the Ojo Bravo Division into the Bravo and J.J. ranches. The Matador Ranch acquired roughly 200,000 acres. In total, about 1.5 million acres were sold at $1.50 to $2 per acre in the early rounds, and the proceeds were used to develop the remainder. The Syndicate, now embracing its destiny as a real estate operation, appointed a land commissioner named F.W. Wilsey in 1905 and stationed James D. Hamlin at the railroad town of Farwell, named, of course, for the brothers, to represent the owners to prospective buyers. The W.P. Soch Land Company contributed significantly to the effort, promoting panhandle land with the boosters' characteristic optimism. Experimental farms were set up near Channing and Bovina to demonstrate to incoming settlers that the panhandle could grow crops, not just cattle. The cowboys called these the poor farms, and they weren't entirely wrong about the prospect of dry land farming on the Llano Estacado. The Dust Bowl would prove that a generation later. But the settlers came anyway, drawn by cheap land and the promise of independence. Homesteaders poured in during the early 1900s, an estimated 95% of them becoming actual settlers rather than speculators. And a land rush transformed the Panhandle from open range into a patchwork of farms and small communities. Charles B. Farwell, the senator and merchant who had arrived in Chicago with $10 and ended up trading 3 million acres for a capital, died on September 23, 1903, at his estate in Lake Forest, Illinois. He was 80 years old. John V. Farwell, the churchman and YMCA benefactor who had crossed the Atlantic to raise British capital and occasionally preached to cowboys on Sunday mornings, followed on August 20, 1908. Neither brother lived to see the end of the ranch they had built. In 1909, nearly all the British bonds were redeemed in full. The investors who had gambled on Texas grass and Chicago beef and the creditworthiness of a pair of dry goods merchants got their money back. The contract with the state of Texas was fulfilled. And on November 1, 1912, the last XIT cattle, 13,560 head, were sold. R.L. Bob Duke, who had been foreman at Buffalo Springs and then assistant general manager, became the last cowboy to actually draw a paycheck from the estate. He stayed on to oversee the remaining acreage leased to other ranchers, a caretaker in a dissolving kingdom. The Farwell heirs formed a trust called Capital Reservation Lands in 1915 to manage and sell the leftover holdings. By 1929, about 450,000 acres remained. By 1943, that was down to 350,000. The selling continued, slowly, steadily, through the Depression and the Dust Bowl and the war years, and into the quiet prosperity of the 1950s. The last parcel of original XIT land was sold in 1963. 81 years after the deal was struck in Austin, the ledger was finally closed. What replaced the ranch were towns. Delhart, incorporated in 1902, became the shipping center for the northern XIT and the surrounding ranches. By 1912, its population had reached 3,500, with 2 railroad lines, machine shops, roundhouses, and a lever control tower. Before the water system was built in 1906, residents had to buy water at 20 cents a barrel from barrels lining the railroad tracks. Channing, the old headquarters town, survived as a smaller county seat. The original frame courthouse had been moved there on wheels by a gang of XIT cowboys and later converted into a hotel when a brick courthouse went up in 1906. Walter Farwell, John's nephew, had built a spacious summer home just outside town with a tree-lined driveway, an artificial lake, and a polo field where he trained cow horses. His wife Mildred's Southern hospitality became a local legend. The XIT General Office Building still stands on a quiet street in Channing, listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Bovina, Farwell, Muleshoe, Littlefield, named for the major who bought the Yellow Houses Division, Amherst, Olton, Friona. A census that had counted 778 people across those 10 counties in 1900 would count 46,000 within a generation. Where there had been thousands of cattle and a few hundred people, now there were hundreds of cattle and thousands of people. The vast emptiness that Colonel Babcock had surveyed from a 4-mule ambulance became farmland, small towns, churches, schools, grain elevators, and highways. Since the XIT had dominated politics in several of its counties, many of its employees had been elected to public offices: county judges, commissioners, sheriffs. Some of those men stayed on, and their families became the founding stock of the communities that grew up on former ranch land. In Dalhart, at the north end of the town's V-shaped underpass, there stands a monument called Empty Saddles. The story behind it is simple. A widow of a former XIT cowboy once asked that a horse bearing an empty saddle be led in the annual XIT reunion parade in tribute to her husband. Someone thought the gesture ought to be permanent. The statue was built. Each August since 1937, Dalhart has hosted the XIT reunion, a rodeo, a parade, and what the organizers call the world's largest free barbecue. The first reunion was held in Fort Worth in 1936 during the Texas Centennial. The old XIT cowboys gathered, swapped stories, and voted to make Dalhart their permanent home. Some of those men had ridden the range when Blocker's brand was still fresh on the first Longhorns. By the time the reunion settled into Dalhart, they were gray-haired grandfathers, but they remembered the windmills turning and the fence lines running to the horizon, and the particular quality of the silence on a panhandle night when the only sounds were cattle and wind. The ranch's records, monthly reports, payroll books, supply orders, correspondence, ended up at the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum in Canyon, Texas. The volumes are enormous, the bureaucratic output of a 3-million-acre corporation that tracked everything from wolf kills to the cost of staples shipped from Fort Dodge. In the late 1920s, the Farwell estate commissioned a young historian named J. Evetts Haley to write the ranch's story. Haley interviewed surviving cowboys, combed through the records, and produced The XIT Ranch of Texas and the Early Days of the Llano Estacado, published in 1929, a book that remains, nearly a century later, the definitive account. Louis Nordyke followed with Cattle Empire in 1949, written more like a novel. Cordia Sloan Duke, who had married into the ranch's world, co-authored a memoir titled 6,000 Miles of Fence, Life on the XIT Ranch of Texas. The title refers to the wire. Charles E. McConnell, known locally as Exit Buck, published his own recollections. Together, these books preserved a world that had lasted barely a generation, one in which a cowboy could ride all day and never leave company property, in which the top wire of a fence doubled as a telephone line. in which a Chicago senator, a Scottish stonemason, and a Texas ranger all played parts in the same improbable story. Consider the arithmetic of the deal one more time. The Capital Syndicate paid $3,224,593.45 to build the State House. In return, they received 3 million acres at a cost of roughly $1.07 per acre. They spent years developing the ranch, fencing, windmills, buildings, livestock, and poured in additional millions from British investors. They operated the largest fenced range in the world for 27 years, ran 150,000 cattle, trailed steers 1,000 miles to Montana, and endured every disaster the plains could deliver. When they finally sold, the early buyers paid about $2 an acre. Later sales brought more, but the margins were never lavish. The syndicate fulfilled its obligations. The bonds were redeemed. The Farwell heirs were not ruined. But by any conventional measure of return on capital, the XIT Ranch was a magnificent exercise in breaking even. That is perhaps the strangest thing about the entire story. The largest ranch in American history was never really in the ranching business. It was in the real estate business, with cattle as a carrying cost. The fencing, the windmills, the cowboys, the divisions, the rules against drinking and gambling, the wolf hunts and the rustler posses and the trail drives to Montana. All of it was infrastructure for a land deal. The ranch existed to make the land worth selling, and once the land was worth selling, the ranch ceased to exist. Today, if you drive through the Texas Panhandle on US 385, you can still find Channing, population hovering around 350. The old XIT office building preserved behind its iron fence. The kind of town where you can stand in the middle of the road and see nothing but flat horizon in every direction. Dalhart is bigger, with its museum and its monument and its August reunion. The Escorbata Division headquarters, the building where Ira Ayton and his family lived during his decade as foreman, was dismantled, moved, and reconstructed at the National Ranching Heritage Center in Lubbock. In Austin, the Capitol Visitor Center has a display about the XIT. And the Capitol itself, that pink granite monument with its leaking copper roof and its dome 7 feet taller than Washington's, still anchors Congress Avenue, still catches the light at sunset in a way that makes the stone look almost alive. In 2022, a man named Drew Knowles bought 11,600 acres of the old Rita Blanca division near Channing. The land was part of the Burson Rita Blanca Creek Ranch. 4 generations of the Burson family had owned it since the XIT was broken up. Knowles grew up in Cincinnati and attended boarding school in Connecticut. He went into money management. But the West and ranching called to him, and he had a particular reason to answer. Drew Knowles is the great-great-great-grandson of John V. Farwell. He and his wife, Abby, a cordon bleu-trained chef who hosts open-fire cooking events on the property, relocated from Colorado, registered the XIT brand in Texas for the first time in over a century, and began running grass-fed Black Angus and American Wagyu on ground that once carried Longhorns with Blocker's brand on their hides. At the 86th XIT reunion in Dalhart, months after the purchase, the Knowles family walked through the crowd carrying a name most people there had only read in history books. The ranch today is not 3 million acres. It is 11,600. It is not the largest fenced range in the world. It is a family operation, small by Panhandle standards, running about 1,000 head. But the fence line is still barbed wire, and the brand on the cattle is still 3 letters scratched in the dust by a trail driver 140 years ago. The wire holds, the brand holds, the deal, that improbable swap of empty prairie for pink granite, endures in 2 directions at once. South, in Austin, where the Capitol Dome still rises above Congress Avenue, and north, in the Panhandle, where the wind still moves through the grass on land that was once worth $1.07 an acre, and a cowboy named Blocker squatted in the corral dust and drew 3 letters that would outlast everything else about the enterprise: the cattle, the cowboys, the Syndicate, the British aristocrats, the fence, and the ranch itself. XIT, scratched in dirt, burned into hide, still there.